Earlier on, we've looked at some physical properties of materials. Things like the texture and the color, just basic physical properties. But now we're going to look at a few more scientific physical properties. Different features of materials, in other words. So the first one we'll look at is called viscosity. And viscosity is how thick a liquid is. The thickness of a liquid. So when we compare a couple of liquids, if we look at water, water is easy to pour and it's not very thick at all. So water has a low viscosity. But when we look at something thick like honey, honey is really slow to pour and it's quite thick when you hold it. And that's called having a high viscosity. So different liquids all have different viscosities. The next one we'll look at is conductivity. And when we're talking about something conducting, we can talk about either heat, conductivity, or electricity, electrical conductivity. And when we're talking about heat, we're saying how easily does heat flow through a material. So for metals, they're really good conductors of heat. So with the saucepan here, heat goes from the bottom of the stove and it flows through the metal inside the pot really quickly. So conductivity is how easily does heat or electricity flow through a material. And when we're talking about electrical conductivity, often you don't want something to be a conductor of electricity. So electricians, they'll often wear rubber gloves because rubber is a poor conductor of electricity. And that means if there's an accident, then the electricity won't flow through the rubber gloves and it won't damage the person. But other things like metals, they are good conductors of electricity. And that's why we make wires out of metal. Alright, the next physical property we'll look at is compressibility. And compressibility is how easy it is to squash or press a material down. How easily a material can be squashed or compressed. So for something really solid like a brick, this has a low compressibility. It takes a lot of force to push down on the brick to compress it. If force pushes on that brick, it will barely move and it will barely get squashed at all. But something like a marshmallow, when we put a little bit of force on a marshmallow, they'll flatten down easily. So marshmallows will have a high compressibility. On the other hand, if you're pulling something apart, then the measure of how easy it is to pull it apart, that's called tensile strength. How easy it is to stretch something. So a lot of materials like metals, they're not very easy to pull apart. If you pull on an iron bar and try and pull it apart, you won't be able to move it at all. So metals, they have a high tensile strength. or in other words, they're strong. But something like rubber, which is designed to be easy to pull apart, they have a low tensile strength. The next one we'll look at is density. And density measures how much matter is there in a certain volume of that material. And that causes something to be heavier or lighter. So how much matter is in a certain volume. So here we have two balls that are a similar size. The first one's made of metal, and metals are really high density, which means there's a lot of matter making up that object, which makes it heavy. But a polystyrene ball, there's not a lot of matter. Even though it's the same size ball, there's not a lot of matter in there. So when you pick up polystyrene, it's really light. So polystyrene has a low density, which causes it to be light. When we're working with density, this is where we can start doing some calculations. Because density is measuring how much mass is there for every volume, which is like a rate. So we can use the most common formula here for density, because we can work out the mass and we can divide it by the volume. Because density is measured in how much mass per how much volume. So if we have something like water, we know that for water, if we have 1 kilogram of water, we know that the volume of that water is 1 litre. And so if we want to work out the density of that water, the density equals the mass, which is 1 kilogram, over the volume, which is 1 kilogram. So water has a density of 1 kilogram per litre. And different materials, they actually have different densities. So something like lead, the really heavy metal, it has a density of 8.7 kilograms per litre. It's much heavier when you pick it up.